Rabbi Walker. She's our techie here, and she's helping us manage all these new technologies to everyone's benefit. So Yishar Kochech to Rabbi Walker. Thanks so much.
Okay.
So it's kind of a bit strange because, you know, we're used to doing this. Whoever joins us on Thursday mornings at 7 or 8, standing usually at the front of the chapel, it's a very different feeling than sitting here in the comfort of one's home without tefillin and talit on, but being able to enjoy a cup of coffee as we speak. So that's a nice thing. And I'd also add that there's something kind of unique. I started to get a sense of this during the class on Tuesday that we had, where although you're only seeing a very small part of it, you know, inviting all of you into my home as we share some thoughts of Torah is really a fantastic thing. And it's something you don't get when you're in the chapel together. You know, the physical contact and the direct eye contact is something very special, but there's something different and no less significant about having people in your home, even if it's only in a virtual sense. So I thank all of you for joining us this morning. And you know, usually we speak for our Dvar Torah on Thursday morning for about 5-7 minutes. May go a little bit longer today. I found a number of interesting connections that I want to share with you that are somewhat related to the Parsha. And so hopefully you'll be able to see those connections as well. The first thing I would say is that coincidentally, this happens to be the yurtzeit for my grandfather today. And something fascinating about that is that I only found out that he was a Levi, and consequently that my father and I were Leviim when my grandfather passed away. During his entire life, I never knew that I was a Levi. So I was actually promoted. Not everybody gets a chance to be tribally promoted during the course of their lifetime. So that was something very unique. And I found it to be particularly poignant because when we talk today about Parshiot Vayakhel-Pekudei, we're discussing the construction of the Mishkan and the preparation of all the various garments and items that the priests from the tribe of Levi, of course, wore and adorned themselves with during the course of their tasks. So having, in the later part of my life, finding out that I was part of that tribal affiliation is something that I found particularly relevant and significant for this morning. The other thing is that usually after we finish the Dvar Torah, what do?
Read Torah.
We read the Torah. And so I'll have to tell you, I'm having, to an extent, something of withdrawal symptoms, not being able to ritually chant from the Torah. So if I break out into Torah trop at some point when quoting various verses, you'll understand why. So one thing I just want to say about the Parsha, because I know you all love statistics as much as I do, that Vayakhel-Pekudei is one of the longest Torah readings you can possibly have. The longest one being, in terms of verses, of course, Matot Maseh, which we read in the summer, and very few people, unfortunately, are around to join that. But in terms of the number of lines in the Torah, because there's a difference between verses and lines, and in terms of the number of lines that one reads in one occasion, this coming Shabbat is, and I'll say is, because I imagine it's being read somewhere in a ritual sense, and maybe not just virtual, it's the longest in terms of lines. They're going to be 405 lines of Torah read this Shabbat, because not only is it a double Parsha Vayakhel-Pekudei, it is also Parshat HaChodesh, which adds an additional 40 lines to the 365 of Vayakhel-Pekudei. And of course, if it happened to be Rosh Chodesh, then we'd have another a number of lines as well, which would make it by far the longest Torah reading that's ever read at one time on one day in one sitting. So on the one hand, I'm having withdrawal symptoms. On the other, you might say I'm grateful. That's a lot of stuff to prepare and have to read it one shot. So it's a mixed bag. The first thing I want to share with you is the beginning, the first word of the Parsha. What's the first word?
Vayomer.
Vayomer would be a good guess, because a lot of things begin with Vayomer, but this one begins with Vayakhel. What does Vayakhel mean? Anyone know?
Oh, I will in a minute.
So Vayakhel means, oh, you're pulling out, I'm going to give you the text in a second as well. So Vayakhel means we gathered. And when we gather, we tend to gather for different reasons. And so as I've started to do with most of my classes and with most of my sharing, at least in these days, I wanted to start with what we should be doing when we gather together here in Canada. And I'd like to acknowledge the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, the original keepers of this land, for hosting us today and for hosting Beth David and my family on their land every day. I think it's something that is worth keeping in mind when we consider where we are and when we gather for different reasons. And so back to this idea of gathering. Vayakhel is an act of getting people together. It's not people simply gathering on their own. Vayakhel means, and Moses gathered the people together for what? To commemorate the conclusion, or at least the beginning of the construction of the temple, for which he'd given instructions and assigned tasks in the last few weeks. So this idea of gathering, of getting people together for a specific purpose, has a very positive connotation to it. And I mention that because if we compare a gathering that took place in last week's Parsha, Ki Tisa, what did people gather in last week's Parsha? Anyone remember? What's the big event of last week's Parsha? No, not a very positive one. What was that?
The tzedakah.
Well, the tzedakah, that was an effort to gather donations, but
For the temple.
For the temple, for the Mishkan, that's right, for the temporary sanctuary in the desert. But in addition to that, that is only a minor part of last week's Parsha. There's a much more significant and momentous gathering of the people that takes place not in such a positive light.
Wasn't the golden calf?
The golden calf, exactly. And what's the word they use when they talk about the gathering for the purposes of the golden calf? Vatikahel ha'edah. The congregation, the community gathered together. But in this sense, it's a very negative one. What did they gather together for? They gathered together because they were afraid, they were disappointed. Moses had disappeared. They didn't know what to do. They gathered together for purposes were not the same purpose as Vayakhel Moshe, as for which Moses gathered the people. And I wouldn't say it's 100% consistent because there are exceptions, but often in the Torah, when you find that word of gathering, when it talks about a community or a group of people gathering, it's usually something that is not for good purpose. Another time where that's used is when some people gather together in the time of Korach for that rebellious event. And usually when we have the term Vayakhel, when somebody, a leader who's demonstrating positive qualities and good intent and purpose, when somebody gathers those people together, it's usually for something positive. And so I wouldn't say that the Torah is consistent with that, but I think the idea of Vayakhel means that whether it's somebody, a leader in whom we have faith and trust, gathers us together for something good, or whether it's a good, perhaps divinely inspired purpose for which we gather, that is the essence of a positive gathering as opposed to a negative gathering. And again, this idea of tikahel, people simply getting together, is something that is a bit questionable in the Torah. And why do I mention that? Because when we get together for these purposes of study, especially whether it's in a virtual or a tangible way, when we get together, we want to be able to do it. Either somebody has initiated some type of gathering for us, or we're led to getting together, if not by an individual, by some kind of purpose that's for positive use. And that's something we should keep in mind. Why do we gather? How do we gather? For what purpose do we gather together? And what we're doing today, I think, and what we're going to be trying to doing over the next, as long as it is, in a virtual sense, is gathering together, perhaps for content as well, but most importantly for community, for positive community experience. And that's the whole idea of this, to maintain, not allow people to feel isolated, but whatever and however we discuss things, the purpose is to allow people to continue to connect. And this idea of gathering is particularly appropriate based on the first word of this week's Parsha. I'll take a pause here for a minute if anyone would like to share some thoughts before we go on.
Hello?
I'm okay.
We can hear you, Brenda. Go ahead.
Okay, I think what you're saying is really very important. So I think now, because of this current situation that we're all in, I think we're starting to
The truth is, I'm the
train
only one here.
ourselves to think of gathering in a very different way than we were accustomed to before all of this came to light.
Michael may be in next
So
week, so if you
gathering
want
doesn't have to be physically, because the gathering can be as
Okay.
we are.
Well, yeah, so I think you'll be in next week. He's just
What I would just suggest, if anyone's
I
not
might-
speaking, when you're not speaking, make sure you put on the mute for whatever purposes. So
Okay, so if you try calling back on Monday, the executive director may be in at that point too.
So
So.
we're
All right.
getting audio from the office now.
Okay.
yeah,
Take
you
care.
know what? It's good to know that things are going on in the office. I think that's a positive thing. I think that's a
But
positive thing.
I think what we're doing is a very positive, and it's giving everybody a different sense of purpose and meaning to do this way. And this way, it's somehow better to do it this way.
Okay, and one of the things we've talked about is whenever this situation, these circumstances change for the better, this is something we need to continue doing, because as much as most of you attend shul on a regular basis, I'd like to believe there are a lot of people out there who, once they get word of the fact that we're trying to do things virtually and who haven't felt either welcome or inspired by coming to the physical building of the shul, maybe we can engage with them in a virtual way, and that might give us an opportunity to be in connection with more of our members than we have in the past. So you're right.
Michael?
Yeah, go ahead,
Michael?
Stephen.
Steve
Sure.
Kraft here.
Yeah.
You bring that up, and I just wanted to say that you made a very prescient comment at the at the Chavurah service last year, because you remember you were talking about alternative ways of running services and to connect to members who cannot come in for one reason or another. And you've just opened up a whole new idea, and I think the other people who have been commenting about reaching out and having virtual services. I mean, I know from a halakhic point of view, you can go back and forth about but to have somebody included this way, even if we go back to, in-person services, and have run the service the way you have, but to have some connection with people outside who can't attend, whether they're chronically ill or whether they have acute illnesses, to just be able to tap in and to see the service in some way is something you suggested we might look at, and maybe now's the time to kind of maybe plan for that.
Stephen? Oh, hi, it's Barbara.
Go ahead, Barb.
I agree. What I have found in the past couple of sessions now is that this is turning out to be a lot more personal than I thought it would be. And it's really terrific that we could still feel in contact with people, even though we are isolated in our own place. And I think there's a lot of use for this.
Yeah, and I think you're right, Barbara. And certainly once people get, overcome their initial intimidation and,
Yes.
and vanity of being seen
Yeah.
on video and being heard by a group of others in this context, I think you're right. There's a lot of personal aspect to this, and I myself have had to overcome a little bit of that over the last couple of sessions. But it's a great means to connect with people, and I hope, as you suggest, Stephen, and you support Barbara, that we continue to find ways to do this in the future.
Michael.
Briefly, that it's always been a big deal for me about education. So if there's something halachic or not about having services online, I definitely think that if there could be a teaching recorder in wherever you're teaching, and then just send that to our website for people to check into, it'll be a great tool to draw people in to our services. So that might be less restrictive doing the educational portion than the religious portion. But I hope that it could happen, Michael.
Okay, thanks, Faye. And I think we will. I think we'll be taking a serious look at this and finding ways to incorporate this technology on a regular basis.
I went on the screen to say that.
So just stay on the screen. Okay. Okay, so I want to relate to a different element of the Parsha that I think will tie in as well with some of the things we've been discussing. And for this, I'm going to share some thoughts by Rabbi Shai Held, who often provides some very creative insight in terms of our Parshiot through his commentary. So one of the things he discusses, and we've talked about this over the last couple of weeks as well, is that fascinatingly, the idea of Shabbat is included in both in the instruction as well as the construction processes of the Mishkan. And it's fascinating that there's such an emphasis on Shabbat. And I want to point to a little bit of the text that tells us a little bit about how this might be relevant. First of all, if you think about the transition that the people of Israel are making as they move from slavery into freedom, the choice of words that the Torah uses is fascinating. And I want to show you the text because I imagine most of you don't have a Chumash in front of you.
I do.
Good for you. I would have figured that. So in Shemot, in this week's Parsha, just after Moses has gathered people together, before he tells them what he's going to be doing and how to go ahead with the construction after all the materials have been gathered, the first thing he talks about is Shabbat. And if you look at some of the words, they're going to sound familiar. We're going to relate to those in a second. So it says, Sheshet yamim te'aseh melacha, uvayom hashvi yelechem kodesh, Shabbat Shabbaton l'Adonai, kol ha'osevo melacha yumat. So on 6 days, work may be done. Now, I'm going to pause here because when we talk about the word used here regarding Shabbat and what might be done on Shabbat, it uses the term melacha. Why is melacha so important? Because when we think about what the children of Israel were experiencing in Egypt, what's the word used to describe their labor there? Anyone know? In English, of course, we use the word slavery. We talk about forced labor, slavery. But what's the word used in the Torah? It refers to it as avodah. And now avodah today perhaps has a variety of meanings because we talk about Torah, avodah, work and Torah. It's a very positive, significant value in the modern Orthodox B'nai Akiva movement, of course. And we talk about avodah as being one of the things we do to worship God. But in the biblical context, avodah here means slavery. And why is that significant? Because when you try to compare what the Israelites are coming from, they served a human master whose goal through engaging them in slavery was to remove their dignity, was to force them to feel that they were, in a slightly anachronistic term, Untermensch, subhumans. They didn't deserve the same things that other Egyptians deserved. And their purpose there was to serve only Pharaoh for his own vanity, for his own purposes. And what were they constructing, at least traditionally, whether in fact that's exactly what they were doing? They're building pyramids. What's the purpose of a pyramid, for the most part?
It's to preserve the afterlife.
It's a monument to the Pharaoh at the time, a place where that Pharaoh and perhaps his family is going to be buried. Meaning, regardless of the hopes and the aspirations the Pharaoh has for an afterlife, it's a place where a body is taken once that body is dead. When you take all those elements of the experience in Egypt and you compare what's going on now, God is...
Like the other 18 people don't either.
God is freeing the people.
There's 20 people, but
God is freeing the people in order for them to serve God. And what's the purpose of God offering these labors, this work here? It's to allow them to have a place where God will dwell among them. Dwell among them, meaning dwell living among them. Not a place where there's a dead pharaoh or a dead monarch for which you're building these, but an opportunity to have a God living among you. And the idea that God lives among you offers you as well, by God's choice to want to live among you, it's offering you a sense of dignity. The work here is dignified work. And the work of building and preparing the Mishkan, the word avodah is not used. It's always melacha. It talks about the tasks, the crafted tasks assigned to people, kol chacham lev, all those who are imbued with this wonderful skill and craftsmanship in terms of preparing the various materials and putting them together to construct the Mishkan, and of course later on the Beit HaMikdash, the temple. So the purpose of this work, it's a different word is used to describe the dignity that's inherent in that type of work, as opposed to the humiliation and the removal of dignity through slavery in Egypt building pyramids to house the body of a dead pharaoh at some point. And how does Shabbat tie into all this? Because in Egypt, it's quite clear, as in many places where slavery and forced labor are used, there is no Shabbat. There's no day of rest. There's no opportunity for people to separate what their daily miserable lives may be from something perhaps better. Granted, all of us, even 6 days or 5 days that we work, we may not thoroughly enjoy our work, but we have an opportunity to take a break and perhaps an opportunity to restore some sense of dignity if our work and our regular routines don't necessarily provide that. Slavery is designed to remove that opportunity for dignity. Shabbat, the purpose of Shabbat is to offer people a chance to regain their dignity or to further appreciate their dignity. Let me correct myself by saying that. And that's why the terms used are different. Avodah, slavery, labor for a pharaoh. Melacha, a holy crafting task, a task that involves and in which is inherent a sense of creativity. Why that creativity? Because when we look at what is written in Breshit as well, what does it say in Breshit? When God completes the creation in 6 days, Vayichulu shamayim va'aretz v'chol tzvaam, vayichal Elohim bayom hashvi'i melachto asher asa, vayishbot bayom hashvi'i mikol melachto asher asa, vayivarech Elohim et yom hashvi'i vayikedesh oto kivo shavat mikol melachto. The emphasis on melacha, the creative process of work, of labor, however we define and translate it into English, which is very different from perhaps daily work. The idea of a creative labor and the building of the Mishkan and later of the temple is an opportunity for us to partake and be involved in a creative labor process rather than a slavery routine process of working. One where there is an opportunity for us to use some of our skills, some of our input, some of our creativity, as opposed to avodah, slavery, where we have no part, we have no input. That's simply orders given to us. We have to do someone else's bidding with no opportunity for our own creative input. And so the inclusion, or perhaps more incorrect, the insertion of Shabbat more than once in this process of building the Mishkan is to make a statement about what opportunity we have to be part of a creative process that allows us to express that divine image in which we were created. Because just as God created in 6 days, and perhaps in a sense created rest on the 7th day, or perhaps ceased from the creation of the first 6 days, so we have the opportunity through that same element of the divine, which is in all of us, to have that same creative process end, but to enjoy the rest on that 7th day, which gives us an opportunity to appreciate just as God did. Because what does God say at the end of every day, and certainly at the end of those 6 days? Saw that everything was good, was very pleased, was satisfied with what God had created. Of course, we know that as we go later on in Breshit, things weren't as good as maybe they were thought to be initially, and with attempts to destroy the world through the flood, etc. But this idea that we have an opportunity to appreciate what we do, to pause what we're doing, just as God did. And when we compare that to the situation of slavery and forced labor in Egypt, there's such a harsh contrast. And so Shabbat is as important about what we are as human beings and Jews as anything else we do. If we can't understand the importance of Shabbat and our ability to identify with the divine in us through that 7th day of rest, then we haven't got a sense of the potential of humanity and what it can do because of its connection with the divine through that appreciation of Shabbat. So it makes perfect sense for Shabbat to be iterated a number of times when we talk about the construction of a temple or a Mishkan in which we hope God will dwell. That's our connection with God, not God's physical or perhaps tangible dwelling among us, but the idea that the Shabbat that we share in common with God, that's where we can understand our connection with the divine in the best way possible. So I'll allow any of you to have some comments. Please to share that.
Michael, does this represent a beginning, sort of a new beginning, having left Egypt and gone through all of that? Now that you have Shabbat, you've got the Mishkan, you've got a brand new beginning for all the ceremonies.
Absolutely. This idea that a new beginning, because there was no Shabbat before. Shabbat is what allows us to be human and divine at the same time. Without Shabbat, we don't have an opportunity to understand what we're all about. Because if we don't have a break from a routine, we have no opportunity to contemplate, to try to investigate intellectually, emotionally what our lives are about. That moment of pause from a routine gives us opportunity to appreciate and evaluate what has been done, just as it did for God at the end of those 6 days. And if we don't have that, then we're losing out on perhaps the most basic element of our humanity.
Michael, I have a question. It's Diane.
Sure.
How do we, if all our days are the same now, because we're all at home doing the same thing day after day after day, how do we differentiate Shabbat?
Beautiful question. And it's going to be more challenging nowadays for us to take advantage of that. But at the same time, instead of having a template offered to you, and don't get me wrong, we wish you, once things are over, to continue to take advantage of that synagogue template that we offer on a regular weekly basis. But now you have to use your skills and your opportunity to do melacha as opposed to avodah, and be creative in how you're going to celebrate Shabbat. We're going to try to do something. This Friday, we're going to be having a Kabbalat Shabbat service virtual online at 5:30. Hope many of you will join us for that.
5:30, Michael?
At 5:30. And there should have been an email sent out, but look on the website, etc.
Coming out today. The email's coming today.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Rabbi Walker. So there are going to be services every day, with the exception of Shabbat at the moment. So there'll be an evening service Sunday through Thursday at 7 o'clock, and then on Friday, in preparation for Shabbat, at 5:30. But this is an opportunity for you to be a little more creative. And as I said before, rather than waiting for something to be presented to you, this is your opportunity to seek ways to make Shabbat meaningful for you. It's not, unfortunately, something which we'll be able to do in community at this point virtually, as well as tangibly in a place of meeting, but you'll have, it's the onus, the burden is upon you to find ways to make your Shabbat meaningful. It's a great question, Diane, and it makes things very challenging. But think of people who live in a small community, Jews who lived on their own, who were traders, merchants, as my grandmother's father was in northern Manitoba, who wanted perhaps to find some way of identifying as Jews, but they couldn't do it in community. They had to be creative in what they did. Unfortunately, I don't know what my great-grandfather did. I'd like to believe he found some way of making Shabbat meaningful in whatever way possible, but that's the kind of challenge we have today when we don't have the benefit and the opportunity to share as a community over Shabbat. So I'm not just throwing it back at you, Diane, but we can have a discussion in the coming days, either when we have different classes or even following the services at 7 o'clock in the evening, we can have a discussion about how can we celebrate Shabbat. I'm glad you brought up the question. It's a fantastic one.
Michael, I have two things I want to comment. First of all, talking about having Shabbat and in unusual circumstances, my grandfather came from Russia, and when he emigrated to the United States, he joined the U.S. Army as a way to earn a living. Mm-hmm. And he ended up being one of the railway workers with Teddy Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War.
Wow.
So and I only found out about, I've got a picture of him actually in his army uniform, but to make a long story short, in order to celebrate Shabbat, he told his fellow non-Jewish workers, he said, if you work for me on my Shabbat, I will work for you on your holidays. And that is how my grandfather was able to, I don't know how traditional he was back then, but he recognized the fact that here he is, a Jew amongst all these non-Jews in a very unusual circumstance, telling his fellow non-Jewish workers, I'm taking off Shabbat, but I'll work for you on your holiday. And it worked.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I want to bring up another element. I said we'd be about 25 minutes, a half an hour. But again, if you have other things to rush to, feel free to leave. There are a couple more points I wanted to bring up, and again, we can have some time for discussion afterwards if you'd like. One of the fascinating things about this process as well of understanding and appreciating and acknowledging the significance of Shabbat, and it's very much connected, is the first commandment were offered a few parshiot before, because this week also happens to be Parshat HaChodesh. What is Parshat HaChodesh about? It talks about the fact that God has given us this month as the first month in our calendar. Now, why is that so important? It's perhaps not any less significant than Shabbat, which is something that humanity should share universally, however it's expressed by different faith and other communities. HaChodesh, this idea of a unique calendar to the Jewish people, again, is something that allows us to have something very special about our own identity within the family of humanity. What do I mean by that? Until the Exodus from Egypt, the Jews, or the Israelites more correctly, followed whose calendar? Calendar of the Egyptians, whatever that would have been at the time. They didn't have their own special identity in terms of a calendar. The first commandment given to us as a nation upon departure from Egypt is to, look, until now, you've been following somebody else's. Here is your calendar. This is the way you're going to live your lives. You're going to set up your lives based on this new type of routine, your own special calendar, even though a lot of the months are named after Babylonian gods. That's another story. But the fact that we have our own routine and celebrate everything in our Jewish lives based on our own calendar. Even modern commemorations, such as Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaTzmaut are based on the Hebrew calendar, not based on the Gregorian calendar. And so that is as important as anything in trying to establish and determine a unique and separate identity for the Israelites initially, and eventually as the Jews. And I bring that up because when we talk about calendars, we share a lot. Having said that it's something unique, there's a lot we have in common with other calendars. First of all, we live in a country where we don't live by our Hebrew calendar. If I were to ask you what the date in the Hebrew calendar was, and I won't ask you or put you on the spot because we'll see the embarrassment on your faces when you try to answer, it's not possible in a non-Jewish society to live only by your calendar. Sure, for our Jewish celebrations, family events, and calendar events, we use that as a basis for that. But we live by a Gregorian calendar for most parts. But it's good to be aware that beyond our own calendar and even the majority calendar, there are other calendars that are important and worth being aware of as well. And anyone know what is taking place this Shabbat, at least this weekend, beginning this Shabbat?
No.
Has nothing to do with our calendar. Has nothing to do with the Gregorian calendar. It's a festival called Laylat al-Miraj. Anyone know what that is? It's a Muslim celebration of the night journey that Muhammad took from Mecca to Al-Aqsa, which is the farthest mosque. And where is that mosque? In Jerusalem. On his steed called Al-Buraq. And the celebration, interestingly, has two parts to it. This part, the nighttime journey, and then the journey from there to heaven. And of course, not the first prophet to have ascended from some high place to heaven. We have Moses on Mount Nebo being buried somewhere. We have Jesus ascending from the Mount of Olives, the same celebration of going up to heaven. And Muhammad as well is attributed to have gone up to heaven on a miraj. What is a miraj? A ladder to heaven.
Huh.
Not something that's unique to Jewish tradition in terms of Jacob's ladder. So I mention this because all these confluences of different events really give us an opportunity to appreciate not just what we have in terms of unique Jewish identity, but those things we share in common, because we all come from a similar understanding of what the divine is and what, again, there are many misinterpretations of that among all the faith communities, no doubt. But if you look at the basis for understanding of God and the divine, there's an incredible amount we have in common. And by the way, the two archangels who accompanied Muhammad on his ascension from Al-Aqsa to heaven are who? Who are the archangels? Jibril and Makal, Gabriel, Michael, two angels who are very significant in our tradition as well. So when we're trying to understand what's unique about our tradition, it's very significant to try to see what we might have in common with others rather than only place emphasis on the distinctions. And the last thing I would say is that I began our discussion today with an acknowledgement to the privilege that we have of sharing the land with those who may have been custodians of the land before us. Wouldn't it be novel if Muslims and Jews who've been custodians of the site that we've mentioned before, Har HaBayit, where eventually the more grandiose interpretation of Mishkan, the temple, was built in different stages and in different periods of time, and the Muslims who see the significance of Al-Haram al-Sharif, this place where Muhammad landed and ascended to heaven, wouldn't it be novel if we were able to appreciate the fact and acknowledge, with an acknowledgement, the fact that all of us in different periods of times, and it doesn't matter who was first or who came next, the fact is throughout history, both Jews and Muslims and Christians have been custodians of that land. And if we were to acknowledge that, it might give us a better appreciation of what it really means to have some element of the divine within us.
Kol hakavod.
Yes.
Beautiful, Michael.
Kol hakavod.
So if anyone has any comments or
I just have one question. Sorry, Michael.
Sure.
I want to just go back to what you were making the distinction between the words Oved and Melachot.
Melacha, right.
Yeah, I just want to know the root of the word Melacha, how that's related, or where, if it's related to king or
So,
angel, or where that comes from.
Melech is Mem Lamed Chaf. Melacha has an aleph in there. So many interpretations say Melacha from the word Malach, angel. And I mentioned Jibril, Makal, Michael, Gabriel. This idea that Melacha is something that's done with kind of a semi-divine element of creativity to it. So angels, perhaps the inspiration of angels, it allows us to have a different kind of status when we engage in melacha as opposed to regular routine avodah. And that's possibly the root of that.
Okay.
Michael, it's Barbara.
Yeah.
Hello. Oh, hi. I just wanted to share an observation today and tie it in with how you began. You began by talking about gathering and how we're all gathering together. And I'm not sure how many people realize that today is actually an interesting gathering of the vernal equinox. And the Earth is completely vertical on its axis. There's no angle, and the sun is directly over the equator. So as of today, we will get more sun, and it will start to, the Earth will angle more towards the sun. So we're also into a new beginning.
Thanks, Barbara.
Right. At 11:54 tonight, I think it's the spring equinox. That's true. That's true. But Michael, it's Brenda.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, you were talking about being creative in ways that we do. And my personal journey, since I'm going to be very personal here, if no one minds, since Norm died, one of the things that that it has taught me to do is to do things in a very, very different manner, not by choice, but by circumstance. But because I've been kind of forced to be creative and do things in a very different way, it really has given me a different perspective on how to live my life. And this is part of it. And as the saying goes, you can still teach an old dog new tricks.
Absolutely.
So thank you, Michael.
Thank you all. You should feel free to continue the discussion, although hopefully we'll be able to have more opportunities to do so on Thursdays and other days during the week. If you take a look at the emails that are being sent out daily, there's a list of all the different activities that are going to be taking place pretty much every day. There'll be something going on virtual that you can plug into. And I would ask that anyone who can, especially those who are saying Kaddish, but not only, we'll have a virtual service at 7 o'clock today, which will include recitation of Kaddish for those who are in that period of mourning. It was an interesting decision. The rabbi will speak more about that at the beginning of that service this evening, but we've decided that under these circumstances, it's something that we need to do as a community, and hopefully that'll answer the needs for many of you who want to continue to join a community, both for ritual as well as educational reasons. So
Is there any plans for morning service, or is it just evening service?
So Howard, what I suggest is bring it up this evening when we begin the minyan at 7 o'clock, and let's see if we can maybe expand on our current plans.
And
Okay.
may I say something to Howard and to say, I just found out that Gita passed away. I did not know. My sincere, warmest condolences to you all. She was a great lady, and I know she'll be missed. And I wish you all the best to you and your family, Howard and Faye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So I'm going to dedicate this last, before you all leave.
Thank you, Yasher Koach.
So before you all leave, I'm going to dedicate this last 45 seconds to Gita, who in the late stages of her life decided to take up on reading Torah. And so I'm going to read the first 3 verses, the first aliyah that we would have read immediately after the Dvar Torah had we been in the chapel. So if you bear with me, as I said, for 30 seconds. Vayakhel Moshe et kol hadat bnei Yisrael vayomer alehem ele hadvarim asher tziva Adonai lasot otam sheshet yamim teaseh melacha uvayom hashvi'i yeh lachem kodesh Shabbat Shabbaton l'Adonai kol ha'oseh bo melacha yumat lo teva'aru esh bechol moshvotechem b'yom HaShabbat. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Look forward to
Yom
spending with
Tov,
you again.
everybody.
And the same to
Yom
you.
Tov.
Toda rabah.
Toda rabah.
See you tomorrow evening.
No, tonight?
Tonight.
Oh, so I just